Well, I think the thing that we've been talking about is this executive team serious about a remote first workplace. After that, there's a whole bunch of other things, right?
Sure.
I do think that this person needs to be a generalist with enough experience in IT, compliance, HR, L&D, ops.
So the
right?
COO.
Well, right, but I'm saying that in support of that organization, right?
Yeah.
This is somebody that is, deep on remote and thin or enough in all those other places so that they can defer to the experts in those spaces.
Hey everybody, welcome to Leading from Afar, a podcast by remote leaders for remote leaders, aimed at sharing knowledge and experience to help make remote awesome within your companies. I'm Scott Markovitz. I was the first hire at Envision and helped build the foundations of the company, from marketing, sales, product, operations, and pretty much everything between. I've also mentored and consulted with hundreds of early stage startups, including a bunch of remote ones. Each episode, we'll speak about hot topics, trends, and the future of remote work. We'll also interview some super smart leaders at all levels of remote teams and introduce you to new tools that can help you succeed as a remote leader. Hey, thanks for tuning into today's episode of Leading from Afar. Today, I'm joined by my good buddy and fellow remote work leader and evangelist, Tyler Sellhorn. After a recent post of his about the head of a remote role, I wanted to dig a little bit more into this topic. It's actually been something that I've been thinking about for the last year, and certainly it's been one of the hottest topics and most exciting job titles for remote workers the last year, though I'm not really buying the hype. In the episode, we dig into what the role is and isn't, who should be hiring the role and who shouldn't be, and is the head of remote really the new COO? So if you're a company executive thinking about how you can make the remote experience better within your organization, this episode is a must listen. Enjoy. Hey, Tyler, how are you today? Thank you so much for joining. How's it going?
Scott, it is awesome to be speaking to you. We've been kind of following each other around the internet, and it's really exciting to be together here today, recording this podcast. Thank you for the opportunity to share and to be learning out loud together.
Yeah, I love the opportunity. I know you, like myself, have been doing this for quite a while, certainly pre-pandemic. I always look for the opportunity when bringing on guests to find someone that I could have a debate with. It tends to be that every one of us who's been doing this pre-pandemic, we're all pretty much in the same line. So it's been very difficult to find someone to kind of bring up points. And even when trying to play devil's advocate, that tends to not work very well. But again, we'll give it the college try and see if there's some maybe diversion somewhere, which probably isn't.
Just to get right into it, Scott, you were posting on the internet earlier this week about thinking of the head of remote as a COO. I didn't know how you wanted to kick it off, but I was thinking and ruminating on that a good while this week, and really wanting to, I don't know, I guess I'd like to push back on that idea that heads of remote should really just be the COO, right? And I think that your intent of what you're stating there is probably directionally correct. Mm-hmm. But to me, I think one of the things that we're finding out as we are, heading off into the open water, as it were, with actual, like work from anywhere, stuff that's not work from home, right? It's the both and of from a home office or from elsewhere. There's this idea that we've done it already. We've done it in the pandemic. So now we'll just move all the stuff up into the C-suite and we're good to go. Right. And I want to say that I believe very strongly that there's a reason why GitLab hired Darren Murph in 2019. Yeah. Right. And it wasn't because they didn't know how to operate remotely. Sure. Right. It was because the ideas that were embedded inside of the GitLab handbook needed an owner. They needed a directly responsible individual. And for that person to be responsible to advocate for the experience of remote workers internally to the company and externally. And that's a different persona than a COO. That's not to say that like heads of remote might not someday be the COO of the future, but I don't know that somebody who is great at being an advocate for the experience of employees is necessarily going to be the best suited for a COO role, who is, managing the operational and business kind of like components, as well as like, how do we attract, good people to our company, and how do we ensure that their experience is legitimate. So I want to just throw that into the hopper right away and be like, hey, Scott, tell me more about your COO thesis, because I'm not sure I agree.
Yeah, so it's good that we finally in this episode find someone where I think at the end, again, we're going to become aligned. But the case that you brought up with GitLab, I think there's a very clear difference between companies that have been remote since day one, GitLab, Doist, with Darren or Chase, or companies like this, Buffer, so on and so forth. They started day one as a remote organization. They hired remotely. They collaborated remotely. They engaged remotely. Their whole business was built around how to do all of these pieces remotely and with very much of an intention. The companies that are now trying to go remote didn't start that way. They went that way during the pandemic because obviously they had no choice. The government said you're closed, no offices are closed, you need to work from home. And the companies who have embraced that this is the future and are now looking for these roles, what I've seen, I've spoken to a number of companies, a number of executive recruiters who are trying to hire for these people. I've had conversations, I've applied for some of these roles myself. And what I've found, like towards the long conversations and getting towards like the last round with multiple of these companies and speaking to the executive team, is at the end of the day, they're really looking for someone to find the tools. Like, what tools should we use for documentation? What tools we should use engagement? Should we be using Slack, or we should be using Twist? Should we be using this or but that? It's a kind of a transactional employee. I don't know if it's also on one side, if they just don't understand, again, what you really need in the big picture, or there's maybe that assumption where kind of my point to the CEO comes along, where how many people exist that have built and scaled a remote organization pre-pandemic, who have that experience kind of across the gamut. I mean, you probably count on two hands, maybe four hands, of how many people have actually done this as like a CEO, as an operations manager for like a remote hire. So there's very, very limited amount of people who've done this. So maybe there's an expectation of like, this is a unicorn. I'm never going to find the unicorn. If I do find the unicorn, how am I going to pry them away from where they're at? But a lot of, again, these people that they end up hiring tend to be people with 3 to 5 years of total work experience. Again, very not strategic, don't have the strategic background. And the point where I think it's a COO versus, again, when you're GitLab, when you're Doist, you've been doing this since day one for 5, 8, 10 years. So when you bring in a Darren, you bring in a Chase, you bring someone like that, you're not trying to redesign how everything goes. You're trying to make things better and improve the experience, the great experience that you already have. Like, you're doing get-togethers, right? Maybe you've been doing an IRL once a year, twice a year, but you're thinking, oh yeah, there has to be some opportunities to get people together on a more frequent basis, and obviously a less significant cost in getting the entire company globally together. And you bring in someone like a head of remote, not saying, oh, okay, well, maybe we'll pay for employees who are living kind of close to each other to go work together and hang out and eat lunch together for the day, or we'll do all different types of things that they're taking a great experience and they're just fine tuning it and making it even better. Where in these other organizations, you really need to redesign how you're operating, how you're collaborating, how you do everything. So I think you're thinking about the COO role, it's right. What tools do we use? Again, I'll bring the tools. Do you use Slack? Do you use Zoom? Or do you use some of these more focused type tools that are built for specific use cases? How do you use these tools? Thinking about, let's say, on the people side or HR side, how do you hire? Do you hire US only, or do you hire people globally? If you're hiring people globally or even in the US, do you pay people with a global compensation, or you pay somebody in one location significantly less than you pay in another location? How do you build culture? How do you onboard new hires? Because the fact that people aren't there in their office where the manager kind of sits next to them to kind of train them, how do you do these things? How do you engage? How do you do mentoring? There was an article in The Guardian in the UK about a year ago. I think it's probably from a Gen Z person complaining about how they've lost their opportunity to be mentored by the senior people, because they tend to be the ones who are working remotely, who are out in the suburbs, and they're frustrated. And it's been a consistent message across all different areas like this, because companies haven't realized this is the future of work, right? Remote is the future of work. Things aren't going to happen by themselves. We need to recreate with intention, which again, across all the episodes I've had, some 40 something, and probably most of the episodes that you've done, the word intentionality comes in more than anything else.
It is a theme.
It is a theme. So if you don't understand that you need to create these opportunities intentionally and how to do them, and like mentoring, okay, maybe you do peer coding, maybe you do like one-on-one mentoring sessions, maybe you do lunch and learns. It's not, okay, it's just going to happen organically in a remote environment when people are on two sides of a Zoom screen, versus I need to think, how do I intentionally create these opportunities for mentoring to happen when people are on the other side of the screen? So I think that's really where the COO, we'll call it the new COO, comes into place, where they have to have the big picture. They had to have had the experience in HR, doing HR and culture things and hiring. They need to know the operations and what tools and how the tools. I think they need this kind of breadth of experience. Again, really probably as either a CEO of a remote company pre-pandemic, or as an operations manager, the first operations person. Maybe it's kind of like a VP people, maybe a people ops person, but someone, again, who has had that experience across the organization, done many different things. I think that's really where a successful head of remote comes into play. I think we'll dig into why I believe most people are not doing this, but at least I wanted to give an answer for my feelings of.
I appreciate that extra context here, because one of the things that I'm hearing you say, maybe I'll start by asking a rhetorical question and then kind of expound. Because when you built a headquarters, you got past your flexible working space, right? And now it's time. Okay, we raised our Series B, and now we're going to build an office. That's our headquarters, right? Who did you go see? Well, you went and talked to an architect, and you talked to a workplace designer, and you talked to the person that did the provisioning for the offices, the equipment and all of that. Okay, well, guess what? You're not going to do that inside of a physical space anymore. What you're going to do is you're going to hire someone who is directly responsible for building that digital first workplace. Correct. You're going to build, and then now if we're going to be in a digital space, that has knock-on effects to, like you described, like which tools we're going to use, right? We're going to use these tools, not those tools, because we are operating from remote first best practices, right? Because we've hired this person that understands the knock-on effects of when you start by assuming that no one is going to be co-located, right? What does that mean? What does it mean? Well, it means that there's going to be things that we do this way and not that way, right? We're going to assume that we need to have, you're never going to have a physical piece of paper for the documents that you're using. So that means you're going to choose, different tools that do not have page breaks as it relates to documents, right? I've had fights with team members that maybe had always used page breaks on their documents, and I'm like, no, seriously, we need to have our default view on our Google Workspace not have page breaks. Like, these are things that are seem silly, right? But if you start from an assumption that people are going to be interacting and collaborating together in the cloud, as it were, right? I mean, why is it that Benioff was right? Why was he right? Well, it's because he started from the assumption that sales teams were not going to be operating in the same office. Well, guess what? That has spread across the entire software industry. Not only, P. Marco was right. Software is eating the world. And you know what? Cloud software is eating on-premise software, right? And, niche software is eating cloud software, right? Every team is going to have its own idiosyncratic way of going about their business, right? Is your team going to spread many time zones? There are different workflows that are built for that. The same way that an office in Chicago was different than an office in Des Moines. Right? Like, what are we going to be doing here, relative to the spaces that we're working from? Those assumptions have been completely blown up. And now we're picking up the pieces, and who's going to do it? I think it's going to be the head of remote, but the people that have the operational and like C-suite strategic things need that person to be in support of those already like strategic things that are happening with the company, and having that person like be the no, remember we're working remotely now. We're working remotely. Hey, remember this is different because we're not in an office. Hey, remember we're not going to see each other in person this week or next week. Maybe just this quarter. And how are we going to make sure that we're intentional when we do show up with each other, which things we're going to prioritize at that time. Right. And which things are we going to prioritize when we are not working at the same time.
Yeah. So I want to hit 2 points. Finishing off the idea of the COO. It's also, again, a lot of these conversations that I've had, there's been that question of where this head of remote person sits across the organization. Is it within the HR, kind of a people organization? Is it within an operations team? One of the roles I spoke about, they brought on a new head of people. So they weren't sure if both roles would go right into the COO directly, or the head of remote would go into the VP of people. Most of these companies who have a VP of people, again, who've transitioned to the remote work during the pandemic, have someone who's probably been like an HR executive for 15 to 20 years at a large global company, who was used to, maybe if they're hiring internationally, to hiring in hubs, right? You have your London and your India and your whatever hubs, and they also may potentially pay locally in those things. So on one side, if you're trying to think of a company, do you want to build a world-class remote organization, or do you want to scale the organization? And one of the things that I kept on especially in this company, kept on going back and back and back to this company saying, well, what happens when those two people clash? Because there's going to be those times where, again, let's say global salary. Well, this head of people who comes from this old school method saying, okay, we're going to hire people in Poland or in Eastern Europe, and we're going to pay them a third of what the developer or somebody's going to get in San Francisco or New York and things like that. Because that's what I'm used to, that's what I know, that's what I have the experience in. But on the head of remote, again, someone who's been doing this long enough says, well, that's not the future remote. The future remote isn't paying a localized salary. It's not saying, hey, this guy in Warsaw is a third of the value of the person in San Francisco. Like, they're giving the same value into the company. They're producing the same thing. So they should get paid the exact same compensation, because they're doing the same job and they're both giving the company the same thing. So what happens in that point, right? Now you want to hire in Poland. Do you go with the best world-class remote experience and pay that Polish developer the same amount? Or do you go with the old school methodology and the people side say, okay, well, we're going to hire in Poland, but we're going to pay them a fraction of the cost. So I think there's a lot of these conflicts, which again, within that organization, why I had always kind of said that you need that person who sits on top of them, because this is the person who's running the organization. This is the person who knows all the pieces and how they kind of intertwine. They kind of go back to the second point that you made. Not only is it important, again, if you're thinking about tools to bring on, but it's what the tool does, what the purpose is, why you're doing it, and is it the best way to do that. So I'll kind of give a couple examples off the top of my head. One, I built, sorry to shout out my own side project, but I built a side project about, 6-12 months ago called Spontaneously to kind of recreate those water cooler moments. And thinking of the experience, there had been some other tools, which are fantastic version 1 tools, that would pair people together in a remote environment. And it would just say, Tyler, Scott, okay, wonderful. And okay, that may work if everyone's working US time, everyone's in the US where everyone has the same overlap. But again, it then requires you and I to have a Slack conversation and figure, should we do the time? Yes, no, what time? Calendars, Tuesday, boom, Zoom links, a mess. But then what happens when you get to the real remote global organization? And this is the issue that I had at Envision, using a product like this. I'm in Israel, and half the people I got connected with were in the West Coast in the US. So I'm very much an extrovert. I love meeting people. I recreated this experience at Envision, but there was no way in hell I was coming on at a call at 8 o'clock just to meet somebody new. So if that's the way this tool is created, well, someone who's coming from the outside who doesn't understand what you're trying to achieve, and this is the right way to achieve, is going to say, oh, well, this is the number one tool for doing this, so let's bring on this one. But they don't look at the nuance. Well, it was never designed for remote work, and it's not built for remote work. And it's not going to work truly in a remote environment. And there's the other cases of, maybe let's talk about like asynchronous communication, right? We're going to go back before that to the 4-day work week, right? Remote now is no longer a carrot that you can dangle in front of somebody to recruit them. That's the standard. So companies are thinking, what's the next thing that we could do? So one of those things is the 4-day work week, which is fantastic. It's a great first step. Won't go into it now. But somebody who would look to do that says, okay, let's transition to a 4-day work week. They don't understand, hey, there's other things around that need to be in place for this thing to be successful, right? If you're sitting in meetings all day long, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days a week, when the heck are you going to get your work done? So you're never going to have a 4-day work week if you're doing synchronous communication, because there's just no time to actually get work done. So you need to shift to an asynchronous by default way of communicating, but it's also, how do you do that? Do you just rip the Band-Aid off and say, okay, no, on Monday, that's it. There's no more meetings and we're all going to figure it out. Or do you need someone who has the experience, who knows the right tools, who knows how to, okay, let's transition over like 4 weeks and here's the process, here's how to do it, which again, somebody who doesn't have, I believe, have that overwhelming kind of experience doesn't understand what the right way and how to do it kind of strategically. It's just, okay, let's pull the Band-Aid and maybe we'll put this in this tool for asynchronous communication, and wonderful. So I think that's kind of my points of like what have been some of the misses of these hires and what they're thinking about. But we'd love to hear your thoughts.
When I hear you speaking, what I'm hearing you say is that this kind of transformation in this type of workplace requires executive sponsorship.
Sure.
Right? It has to be the strategic goal
Yep.
of the company to build a remote first workplace,
Yep.
including things like time independence,
Yep.
including things like how are we going to pay people, right? Because you came at it with like, well, they're bringing the same value, so blah blah blah. Well, that may not align with the strategic goals of the company,
Sure.
right? So how you choose to pay people, localized salaries or not, it depends on how the business is operating strategically.
Yeah.
Right. Do we want to pay the top of the market for every single person that we hire? Well, that may or may not be the case depending on the company, or it may emphatically be. And so the thing that you have invited us into, and I want to repeat the invitation, is to do it on purpose, right?
Yes.
Be declarative, be explicit, say what we are about, declare your values, declare your mission, declare your vision, and then make decisions that follow on from that. And I think one of the things that we're saying about choosing to hire ahead of remote is to say, okay, we are strategically going to decide to build a workplace that is operating from the first principle that we are very rarely going to be working from the same location. And or hubs, as you described, in a multinational corporation, right? We're going to say we're going to hire people in Warsaw, right? Or we're going to hire people in Frankfurt. Well, there are things that come strategically from making those location-based decisions. And what we're saying is that decoupling the company strategy from specific locations has an accelerating, like much sooner, like decisions that used to be made much later in a company's growth, right, are now happening much earlier. And I think in truth is probably going to be a much better outcome, like in the long term. Obviously there's some examples here of organizations that have chosen very declaratively early on to be a remote first organization. But if we're saying that this is the future of work, more organizations are observing and experiencing the productivity and the opportunity, like just choosing not to commute. Like this is like first order effects, right? Of saying, okay, we're going to give everybody in our company a raise in terms of the amount of time that it takes for them to get to their place of work and the expense of getting there, right? Now the default is going to be, hey, why are you making me commute? This work does not require me to be present near you to be done. Like, why do I have to do that? Right? And companies that choose to have an office first culture need to have a very strong set of reasons of why they are choosing, hubs and in-person work. And it better be more than just as you described. Well, we want to make sure that water cooler talk happens.
Yeah.
Because, Scott is building a side project that's answering that need for remote first companies. And it's not so difficult, right? We found out that it wasn't quite so difficult as we thought it was, especially for people that are working inside of screens in the first place.
Yep.
What's the point? Right. And you got to be so remote is a forcing function, not only for remote first organizations that are building the workplaces of the future, but also for those organizations that are emphatically against that. Like they're just like in the streets for, literally in the streets, they're commuting to the office, that they should never be that kind of style. Like they're going to have a reason why they're not choosing that.
Yeah. So I think that brings to a question of whether, again, with the lack of experience, with the strategy in place, whether companies really should be hiring for a head of remote based on what we've seen just in the last week, right? We've seen the two complete polar opposites. On one end, we've seen Apple, the open letter from Apple employees, like, what the is this? Like, I'm not coming back. I don't need to be in the office. Your marketing is telling the world that your Apple products allow them to work remotely and be successful remotely, yet you require your employees to be in an office.
Requiring you to be in Cupertino.
Yes. How you haven't gotten this in the last 2.5 years, baffling. And then you see the polar opposite where Airbnb says, you know what? We see this thing works. You live, you work, just go for it. Like wherever you want to be, wherever you want to live, wherever you want to work. If you want to travel, you want to be a digital nomad, and for 3 months a year, go change your locations or what have you, go do it. So I think we're still 2.5 years into this situation. And in some cases, we're still at the starting line where companies just still haven't gotten this, whether it's Apple, whether it's Google, they're still forcing and trying to get back to the office. And it's, again, that idea where they just haven't understood where we have to invest in redesigning the culture, redesigning the operations, upskilling managers, and all these investments that have come into running a remote organization. Because I think there's a clear difference, right? If you look at any of these companies who are launching as remote first, right? I had a number of them on the podcast last year and also this year. They're all async by default from day one. Like you would think, here's a company hiring all over the place. And day one, when you're just trying to build something and launch something and get that initial traction, you would think, okay, just natural. Everyone's on huddles, kind of like in Zoom calls, like all day long, just to be able to collaborate and get something done. But they're like, no, we're going to be all over the world. We're going to hire all over the world. We don't need to talk. So these companies who are starting from day one are coming, hey, we're going to be remote first and best practices of remote organizations. Just like if you ask any company who's launching now, I'll give you 3 options. If you launch a company today, would you be fully remote? Would you be office, or would you be hybrid? I can almost at 100% guarantee that 0 of those companies would say I would be hybrid. Now, you're going to get probably most on remote. You'll get some in the office, okay. But you would get none that would say, hey, you know what? Yeah, it would be great to have a central headquarters here where you have some percentage of people who are coming in and you have some people over there. And nobody would do that. Who would be that moronic to kind of come from that position and say, yeah, we want to have all people all over the place and not be able to figure out how to engage and onboard and all those potential issues with career trajectory. Yeah, we want to do this from the start. But so many of these companies are coming back to this. So again, just thinking from that perspective of when they're now saying, okay, no, we should bring in someone to kind of do this right. They're still kind of not yet at that point where what do we really think is the right? And are we really committing to this? And are we ready to go all in? Yeah, we're going to go all in on no schedules and let's say 4-day work weeks or not. We're going to go on async. We're going to go on IRLs 3 times a year. We're going to do it all. Or okay, maybe we're still going to have some kind of synchronous calls and maybe we'll try to do some async and, maybe we'll do flexible Fridays or something like that. Then kind of what's the point of this person that's coming in there? Again, they're just coming in, okay, let's use this remote tool for this perspective. Let's use that tool for that thing. Again, just as tools to kind of cover the little bits and pieces versus having that strategic picture of, well, if you want to go remote, you need to go fall in. It's not, putting a toe in the water. You got to jump in head first into the deep end. And it's going to require, 4-day work weeks and getting rid of schedules and asynchronous and getting the team together in IRLs and paying this and doing this. And I think companies just aren't there yet, or maybe they don't even know that they need to get there. And so I think that's a lot of my battle with these roles that, if you're a remote, as I said at the beginning, if you're a remote company from pre-pandemic, hell yes, you should have a head of remote, because you've been doing this long enough. This person is only going to make the experience better. If you shifted into during the pandemic, if you're, again, jumping head in, then yes, you should probably have a head of remote. And again, for me, we'll call it the new COO. If you're not 100% sure like what we should be doing and going full in, you should not be hiring this person, whether like the transactional person to tell you what tools, or a more senior person, because you're just not there, and this person's not going to be able to provide the value. And even for themselves, like if I came in, like, again, like you see what the future of work is like. This is the ultimate, like, what's the best way that you can run an organization? So you have the expectation, if you came into a company to be their head of remote, right? We're going to get rid of schedules. We're going to go based on output, and we're going to go on doing this and this and this and this. And if you weren't given that ability to do all those things to make like the best type of organization, well, you're going to get burnt out, because they're like, oh, okay. Like, if we're still doing sync, okay, we're hiring all over the place, but we're still doing synchronous meetings, and maybe doing a little bit of async, so the person, in Poland doesn't have to stay in like a later call. Or like, how happy are you going to be with building like a half-assed, remote organization or remote culture?
Well, I think we're circling around a similar topic of the theme there is that are you serious, right?
Yeah.
Are you serious? And I think that's one of those things where it's very clear early on in the pandemic, that the Goldman Sachs CEO, he's very stridently saying remote work is an aberration, and and you mentioned it earlier of like Goldman has a really strong culture of mentorship and in person, like shoulder to shoulder work that happens in office, right? And so if you don't have the executive sponsorship to make this change, you shouldn't choose to go remote. And that's what we were talking about earlier. And so I think that the thing to me is like, okay, as I'm talking to people and saying, hey, I would love to be your head of remote. I want to wear that title, right? I've got my little website, head of remote.xyz, trying to say, here are the best people, follow these people, talk to these consultants, right? Like these are the companies that are trying to build for the future of work. I think it's one of those things to say, okay, I would be very direct in a recruitment process to say, this is what's possible, right? Is this what you want? Right. Here is my 30, 60, 90, 6 month, 12 month, 18 month plan of like how I would implement a digital first, remote first transformation or maintenance. If we're already kind of starting there, we're going to sit down with the executive team and interrogate where they are spending their time and what they are spending their time on. Right. Because once you move remote, right, because oftentimes, when we say, okay, why is it these people want to say we're going to be hybrid? Well, because they've got like billions of dollars invested in real estate. And I got to imagine that Goldman is exposed to some commercial real estate investment, right? There's going to be, we have to think about why people are saying the things that they're saying and not just assume that they aren't motivated by things other than what might be the best way to work together, right? And so there's a reason why legacy companies get disrupted, right? It's because there are better ways to do things, and if they aren't willing to embrace them themselves, right? Airbnb recognized, right? Brian Chesky, in the reverse, right? Said, hey, we're about, like, we've been enabling this type of accommodation, right? And you know what? We probably would become a better company if we like hired like whole hog, like hired the entire like digital nomad space to just come work at Airbnb. They would become a massively better company overnight, right? And we have friends in the remote advocate space that have been living in this way for decades.
Yep.
Right. And I think it would be really interesting to see them recruit those people to be
Sure.
like, hey, help us be better for this market, because it's big now and it's becoming larger every day. And I think that there is an opportunity that we're losing. You mentioned Apple, right? I know of people that are in the indie, Apple iOS developer community that stopped working at Apple. They were employed by Apple Incorporated, Apple Computers, right? And they moved away and were excommunicated from the company because they were not willing to stay in Cupertino, right? That talent no longer exists inside of Apple, and now they are working independently for themselves. I think it's really important for people to be reflective and to look at the data and to say, what does this mean? If we choose this, what will happen, right? Because it's not a secret. It's not a secret who wants to work remotely and who doesn't, right? It's not a secret of which companies want to stay in the office and which ones are open to working remotely. Why is that? Right? It's not hard to do a little bit of investigation and kind of interrogate the reasons why people are saying things that they're saying. If you just take things at face value, you're going to be missing part of the story because people are invested in real estate and people are invested in, like cloud infrastructure. There's a reason why people are saying the things that they're saying, and don't miss it, right? There's a why.
Yeah. One of the things that baffled me maybe the most out of the last 2.5 years is companies have spent millions and millions of dollars researching and pulse surveys and things to their employees, right? Google is probably most famous for doing more about employee research and happiness and Project Atlas and some other ones more than anybody else to understand what are the employees thinking, and they want things like that. It's been absolutely crystal clear wherever you look, everywhere you look, that people require flexibility, right? Fully remote, some are remote, whatever it is. They require, hey, I, the individual, am going to choose where I work, when I work, why I work, all those things like that. And the executive team could get all this data and to be crystal clear what the expectation is, what the message is. And they just say, we're not going to do that. Either we don't care, we're like tone deaf, we're like, what the heck what's going on there, to say, we understand there's a significant amount of our people who don't want to come into the office anymore or be able to choose when they come in, and we're going to force them back in. It's such a miss. And I think it ties into your Goldman Sachs point of, I've been saying probably similar to you that the last 2.5 years, this is in 10 years from now, this will be the blockbuster case, right? Business people know what have we learned like the last 20 years? It's always a blockbuster case. No, Netflix, they're both doing DVDs, and Reed Hastings decides one day, hey, you know what, this cloud thing is probably the future. And back then, if you can remember, downloading like a 3 meg song on whatever it was, dial-up took 45 minutes.
I got my DVDs in the mail too, Scott. It was great.
Yeah. So thinking like the future was that direction. And obviously we see what it is now. But the Goldman Sachs case, right? They love their interns. They're hungry. They're coming on, they're working 18 hours a day and they're super, whatever nonsense that is. Mm-hmm. But those are the same people will then get the same opportunities to build the future of finance through crypto. And the crypto is offering them the opportunity to work from home. And I think the biggest thing that I try to think about in little points, especially when I talk to Gen Z people, like Gen Z people have never worked in an office. So they've always had that opportunity of flexibility of remote, of digital nomadism, whatever the terminology you want to use. And now you're trying to force them into an environment that they don't have the experience. You tell them, oh, the office is great for collaboration and work and things like that. Well, they've never experienced that. And they've done fine. In most cases, again, if done right in a remote environment. So I feel it's like, this is a great opportunity for I think for crypto and the future of currency. Like, this is the moment. Why? Because there's going to be so many people that are coming from JP Morgan's and Goldman Sachs's, and they're going to take the best minds that are building the last, however many hundreds of years of finance. And they're going to be the ones that are kind of joining these crypto companies, or building the future of finance and distributed everything else. this is the financial blockbuster moment. We already know that that's has always been in that direction. It's been
a core value
like
of Web3 is decentralized finance, right?
Yeah.
And that is aligned with the idea that we ought not be centrally located.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the crypto companies that are going to succeed are the ones that embrace the fundamentals of their core product.
Yeah.
Distributed, decentralized, right? That is the story of the internet. That is the story of technological change over the last 70 years.
Yeah.
Right? What has happened? We have abstracted away computation, right? Okay, well, just keep going, right?
Yeah.
Don't stop.
Yeah.
Right. And what is the end result in 2022 as Scott and Tyler are having a chat, right? It's that we can have a deep, interesting conversation that can be recorded and listened to by anyone at any time.
Yeah.
And that is going to be the future of finance, of workplaces, of all kinds of human to human interaction and computer to computer interaction. There's going to be a decentralization that is inherent to, we talked about it earlier, saying, okay, well, what did Benioff get correct? Well, that the customer data needed to live away from the office, right? Well, okay, keep going, right? Don't stop.
Yeah. So maybe jumping in kind of like a couple little points and get your perspective. So hopefully there's multiple company leaders who are listening to this episode here who are thinking to themselves, again, we want to make the remote experience better in whatever capacity it is. And maybe we're thinking, hey, it would be a good idea to hire a head of remote or a remote advocate, whatever title you want to throw in there. And who would they naturally look at? They would look at people like yourself, like myself, again, people who've been doing this for a while. So if some of you, again, you are in the position now, as you may be now, and kind of interviewing for these roles, before you even get into the interview, tell me what you would say in an interview. What would you do in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? Like, what would be the fundamentals? What would you do first? Like, what would be important and why? So I think it's important, again, for anyone listening who's in that leadership position, who's thinking about this, to understand what do we old school remote leaders think is the right way to do it? Is the right way? Is the big picture? Let me know your thoughts.
Well, I think the thing that we've been talking about is this executive team serious about a remote first workplace? After that, like there's a whole bunch of other things, right?
Sure.
I do think that, this person needs to be a generalist, with enough experience in IT, compliance, HR, L&D, ops, and ops broadly.
So the COO.
Well, right, but I'm saying that in support of that organization, right? This is somebody that is, deep on remote, right? And thin or enough in all those other places so that they can defer to the experts in those spaces.
Sure.
Right. I mean, you don't want to hire, in my opinion, right? You don't necessarily want to hire if you hire someone who's deep on IT, right, in a head of remote role, guess what you're going to get? That hammer is going to be pounded everywhere. It's an IT problem. It's an IT problem. It's an IT problem everywhere. And that's not what you need, in my opinion. What you need is someone who is conversant with an IT expert to then be able to apply a remote first layer to that experience, right? Or at least somebody who is able to interface with a service provider or a vendor to think about, okay, how does this apply to our workplace? Right. And I think that, having those conversations where it's like, okay, we're going to do some tool evaluation, but I think to me, you got to start from the fundamentals, right? You got to say, okay, when do we use the tools that we have existing already, right? And when do we add something else, right? And then which tool do we use for which situation, right? And I think it's really important to remember that there's a broad spectrum, right? To say, okay, here is text only, and on the other end is an in-person offsite, right? And probably somewhere in the middle is that video conference,
Yep.
Right. And, really like the video conference now is kind of like shifting more towards the in-person, right? These
Yep.
are those synchronous conversations where we either had to physically co-locate or we had to co-locate, based upon our different time zones to talk at the same time.
Yeah.
And then there's this broad space in between, flat text and a video conference that every remote communication tool is trying to fill the void, right? And there's some early tools that are out there that are trying to fulfill this space, and they are good enough, right? But they're gonna get better, right? And I think, to me, the number one thing that a head of remote is going to be able to do is going to be able to take a lot of those conversations and interactions that happened in a video conference, and move them off of the calendar. Right. And so the calendar and how people are spending their time is the most precious resource and the hardest to get overlap in, when we even just say, hey, we're going to have people in New York and in California. Okay, well, how are they going to collaborate? Well, so far we've gotten on some conference calls and they've kind of been horrible. Right. Stop doing that. Stop doing the horrible thing and do things from first principles to say that it's going to be hard for us to get in at the same time very often. So we're only going to deploy that when we absolutely need it, right? When are we going to get on a video conference? When it makes sense, when we need to have faces talking to other faces, right? And that isn't really needed very often, especially if you have had the opportunity to get together in an in-person, like offsite. This has been the experience of the best remote first organizations, right? Has been to say, if you can get new people to meet their boss right away, that will accelerate that person's onboarding very, very quickly. Because just let's face it, we have monkey brains and they need to do the primate thing, right? And we have to start from the physics of our psychology, right? You cannot break the fact that the sun shines on only one part of the world at a time. And you can't, affect the fact of the matter is that we are people and we are humans. And there are things that follow from that we need to address directly. You have to start with the people. And then you can build processes on top of that, and you can select products that will be smart and begin with good. We're not going to optimize for being able to get on video conferences. We need those, right? But they're not going to be the primary mode, right? Right now, the experience of people working from home has been to say like 80% of our interactions and collaboration is going to happen in a video conference. That's the wrong balance. It really should be 100%. The other way around. It should be like 20% of the time, if that, right? Depending on how strong the organization is in terms of building up, an asynchronous work culture. And I think that's really what we're saying, is that like, how are we going to offer a 4-day work week or a time flexible arrangements to caretakers and parents and people that want to optimize for their lives away from work, right? And whether it's parents or caretakers are the really obvious ones. Like, how do we make inclusive work cultures that include those types of people, like myself, right? I work a non-linear work day, right? I work 90 minutes before I cook breakfast for my family, right? And I pick my children up from school every day. Right. Well, I probably have, like a solid 4 hours in the middle of my day around lunch that like I could have like a lot of like interactions, like we're talking together, like at the beginning of that time. Right. Why did this end up here? Well, it's because I have time on my calendar that doesn't have anything to do with my work. Right. And so I think it's really important for us to start from the people, start from, the assumption that we aren't going to easily be able to work at the same time because we are hiring across time zones and the sun only shines on one part of the world at a time.
The work life, I don't like balance, integration, or quality of life, I think is so crucially important now. And I love what you said. I have somebody on my team who just came back from maternity leave. And like the first day she came back, I said, listen, I know what it is to have a new baby at home. I said, listen, the team may not be fully async yet or on board doing these things, but I am. I said, what they say, especially for mothers, right? When the baby sleeps, you sleep. I said, the baby takes a nap at like 11 o'clock, go take a nap at 11 o'clock. If you need to do this, I'm like, go do this. Don't ask me. Don't ask for permission. Like, not that I don't care, but please don't feel like you need to work within like a box and say, okay, I could do this in my lunchtime. I could be with my kid during this hour, that hour. I'm like, you need to live your life, right? At the end of the day, what do I care about? Results. So what that means is at the end of the day, results. What your day looks like that encompasses to get those results, that's up to you. Like whatever is most comfortable and most effective for you, go do that. And that's the way it should be. And I want to hook in one of your points I really liked about the person not being siloed and kind of sitting across the organization. And where, again, I very much aligned in this idea. It's, the case of the IT person, right? If you had a true kind of remote person that said, hey, you know what? Cybersecurity and security is a bigger question in a remote environment because we're not in a corporate network and firewalls and blah, 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 and this, so on and so forth. If you had just an IT person, they'd come down, like you said, with a hammer, you need to do this and that, and probably most likely, hey, you probably should be doing some type of surveillance of your employees and computers and things that you're doing, where when you have that overarching kind of experience with operations, with culture, with HR, things like that, you could say, the security, the firewall, this thing, VPN, like that makes perfect sense. But like the surveillance, well, that's not trusting your employees. And like the single foundation all the way at the bottom, the pinnacle of remote work is trust. So if you start adding surveillance because you feel like it would make the company more secure, well, you've just thrown away the whole book about being a remote organization because you don't trust the employees. So it's someone having that, again, experience and that knowledge across different areas that can kind of bring in those nuances where, yes, we definitely need to bring in more security tools and to protect our IP and employees and things like that. But there's a fine line, right? When it comes to, one side, yes. When it comes to employees and security and surveillance, things like that, like that's a no-go. Where again, it's like to your point, it's so important to have those people with that overarching experience, again, who can kind of bring in from the side out. From a culture side, it doesn't make sense. From a finance side, like whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think it's really important for us to not make assumptions. And even in that example that you gave, right, there are going to be compliance issues, like inside of a remote first workforce that maybe is working inside of a finance, expression of a workplace. Like remote first finance organizations are going to look different than other companies, right? Because of regulatory environment, right? Like the SEC is going to come calling if you're not behaving in an appropriate way, and you need to be able to have an answer for the feds. Right. That is going to appear different than other situations that, like a B2B SaaS company is going to look different. Right. Like that's going to be different than a consumer finance organization. Right. Like how are we going to handle, that type of data, relative to, this is somebody's corporate email. Right. I mean, okay. Well, then that's a different, data handling situation. I think it's really important that we are respectful to, those, compliance officers that exist inside of those organizations. And if they're going to, attempt to, build we were talking about crypto companies, like there's going to be versions of remote that look different just because of the industry they happen to work in. And I think that's the thing that we're finding out is that those idiosyncratic kind of like this is specific to this industry or this kind of company or these leaders and these people. I think that's the thing that is possible in a remote first workplace that was never possible when we said we're all going to live within 30 miles of this headquarters, right? Agreed. Now we can build it exactly to spec because there isn't we're never going to be able to avoid the fact that we are humans. Right. But we are going to be able to avoid some amount of the physics constraints by saying we aren't going to all co-locate. Right. Sure. So now we can build an even better remote or even better workplace because we're not dealing with also the strictures that come with being in the same location. There's trade-offs all the way around.
Yeah, I completely agree. I guess we're running low on time. Any last questions, thoughts you want to share, bring up here?
Well, I guess maybe the thing that I want to invite everyone to do is the same thing that we've kind of been talking about as a major theme, is to say that remote first workplaces do cause, I mean, just shout out to the OG head of remote, Darren Murph, right? He's been saying it forever. And I'm so grateful that people have caught on to this idea and have been repeating it.
Sure.
That remote is a forcing function for intentionality.
Oh yeah.
And the fact is that you're going to have to do things with more reflection and more purpose than ever before, right?
Yep.
There were so many unspoken assumptions that went into, co-locating in an office that have been completely blown up by the pandemic. And we need to be reflective, and we need to think about, okay, how are we going to show up? Whether that's a remote first or office first company going forward, decide and express that decision clearly.
Yeah, completely agree. So for people listening, how do they find you, get a hold of you, learn more about this head of remote project that you're working on? Tell us.
The clearinghouse for all my stuff is tsell.link. I'll share it with Scott for the recording, but yeah, you can find all my things there. I'm myself on LinkedIn and on Twitter, so it shouldn't be hard to find me if you want to find me there, but you can find links to everything at tsell.link.
Awesome. So Tyler, I appreciate the conversation. And as expected, at the end of the day, when we thought we were going to diverge, we end up in the same place, which again is the way it always works with anyone who's been doing this long enough. Again, we're all in the same plane. So I greatly appreciate the time, greatly appreciate the insights and the feedback, and so happy to have you on. And until the next episode, everybody, thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate you.
Thanks again, everybody, for tuning into today's episode of Leading from Afar. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can learn more on our website, leadingfromafar.com, and subscribe to the podcast in your favorite app. This podcast is all about you, the remote leaders. We'd love to hear from you with your feedback or ideas for future topics and remote leaders we should be speaking with.